Every day, intelligence professionals, operators, and decision makers are inundated with information. The challenge isn't collecting more data or getting more data. It's understanding what matters, what changes the operational environment, and what leaders need to be paying attention to right now. Let's get into it. Welcome to the ISR Debrief. Welcome to the ISR Debrief. I'm Wesley Rose, Creative Director at Integrity ISR. The ISR Debrief is a new podcast where we're looking to break down the developments shaping intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting, and multi-domain operations. Joining me for every episode is Chad Hartman, Senior Vice President of Global ISR Solutions at Integrity ISR. Chad is a former U.S. Air Force intelligence colonel with more than 30 years of leadership experience across ISR, special operations, and targeting. Chad served as NATO's Targeting and Collection Management Authority from 2020 to 2024, and previously commanded the Global Nuclear Surveillance Center, the Pacific ISR Group, and a JSOC intelligence squadron. Chad, welcome to the inaugural episode of the ISR Debrief.
Hey, Wes. First of all, it's great to be with you again. I always look forward to these opportunities.
Before we get into today's discussion, it's time for a section we call Headliners. These are the stories, developments, and emerging trends that have our attention this month across the national security landscape. Chad, let's start with Ukraine and Russia. What developments have stood out to you over the last month?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the world. And even in some of this, we get muted as things continue on. We get a little numb to the news developments. I think there has been a couple of key developments starting, as you mentioned there, in Ukraine and Russia. What I've seen here in the last month is kind of a shift on both sides. And I think it has to do with Russia responding to some Ukrainian success, where they're really focused on doing these periodic kind of scaled operations at range, where they're actually doing deep strike, long range operations at very intense scales to be able to have a much greater impact effect on the current situation. You see it with Russia repeatedly, and they've had some great success the last few months doing this against particularly the oil industry there in Russia, where they're hitting refineries, oil storage, key port facilities transfer. And it's starting to have a significant impact on the Russian economy. And we're seeing that play out. I think because of that, Russia has taken that page out of the playbook and tried to apply the same thing against us. What they view as a strategic target for them is really the population of Kiev, where they're really going after population centers. They've been doing this on the Donbass further out in more close range, close strike operations. But now we're seeing them take that model and take the lesson learned from Ukraine to be able to do these mass attacks at range and be able to do deep strike. And they're doing that now persistently, or at least starting to do that more frequently there in Kiev. So I think that's probably the development I've seen play out more in the last month or so. And I think it's in direct response to some success Ukraine has had in the battlefield the last few months.
Now, we've talked about Ukraine and Russia. What are some things that have piqued our interest with U.S. and Iran?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that everybody sees, obviously, is where does this stand the peace talks? The Strait of Hormuz in particular, is that going to open up? And we're seeing these in the middle of supposedly stalemate and still have a holding peace agreement. You're still having strike exchanges of fires. I think really it's not a big new development, but it's important to remember, and it kind of highlights, Iran is hitting what it thinks is its strategic target set for impact and be able to do that. And that is the key ally countries, their key infrastructure, whether it be airports, port facilities, oil, they're going after those kind of aspects. The U.S., when they do the counterstrikes, the defensive strikes as they're called, I think what you're seeing there, and it's really important, but it kind of tends to get me glossed over, is we're focusing on key radar site, command and control missile sites. The whole point of there is to be able to maintain our strategic asymmetric advantage, and that is control of the air. And if you look at what has really been decisive for us in both Israel, is to be able to be masters in decisive control of the air. And I think that's the continuing aspect. As this thing plays out, you're going to see us keep those focused so that we maintain that capability throughout to be able to enable us options depending on how these peace talks go.
All right. So we've talked about U.S. and Iran. We've talked about Ukraine and Russia. Well, what other things are you seeing around the world? Is there something else?
Yeah, I think we get fixated on those particular regions of the world, rightfully so. But I think there's always key developments taking place under the radar. One that stood out to me here in this really the last few weeks is, and it really illustrates how small the world is we had a Dutch frigate in the South China Sea that China actually came and did some pressure operations against, kind of forced them out of an area of operations in the Paracel Islands down there. And using some electronic warfare, electronic interference is part of that equation to do that. So now you got a European ally who's doing freedom navigation operations in the South China Sea being impacted by probably our greatest adversary and threat that we see out there in the Pacific. I think what is important and that coincide with is we've seen this shift in the last few weeks, last month or so out there where China is really kind of backed up a little bit off of Taiwan. Some people, I think, maybe misread that and go, hey, they're kind of calming down a little bit on Taiwan. But I think what you're seeing is just a shift in focus where they're playing more, they're having a lot more presence with their People's Liberation Army Navy and doing more extensive operations across the East China Sea, the South China Sea, all the way out to that first island chain. So they're trying to exert their influence in a much greater geographic area and do it more persistently over time than just focusing on cross-strait situation with Taiwan. And you saw that play out with this situation with the Dutch. I think that's something, there's a quiet little shift that's taking place behind the scenes there in the Pacific as China methodically over time starts to exert its influence at a greater scale.
Before we move into today's main discussion, we want to say a quick thank you to today's sponsor, Integrity ISR. Integrity ISR is a mission-driven partner advancing capabilities across ISR, space, targeting, and electronic warfare. Learn more at integrityisr.com. Now, speaking of the South China Sea and the Pacific, there seems to be something possibly brewing there. What are some key lessons we've learned from recent military operations that we could apply if there was a conflict in the Pacific?
That's a phenomenal question. And I think if you look at it, we've talked this a couple of times, we were probably seeing the greatest transformation in the character of war that we've ever witnessed. And so how do we see that playing in the Pacific? And I think there's some things that will be very similar to what we're seeing here recently, particularly in the last couple of years in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Some things will be different. But for those that are similar, I think I think one thing is so important that's kind of stood out here, a lesson learned, is the side who sees first wins, right? And what I mean by that is your ISR piece probably is gained importance, and we've talked this somewhat, where if you go into hunter-killer missions and doing that, the hunting is the hard part. And those who master the hunt, the ability to sense, to be able to sense and share or fuse and tee up solutions for kinetic or non-kinetic operations, that side who can do that better wins. And I think if you take that into account, that kind of leads to the second, I think, attribute that's going to apply. And that the ISR architecture is the decisive capability. It's not necessarily the sexy looking platform or the new missile or the new frigate or the new, ship or airplane that's out there, the new platform. It's really about that architecture and ability to link all those things, particularly on the ISR front. Going back to that first axiom, I think that's coming out, that whoever senses first wins. And so I think that puts a premium on ISR architectures, particularly out in the Pacific. And then I think the third attribute goes into that F2, T2, EA. And that's that find, fix, that track, target, engage, and assess. That's an individual kill chain. But whoever can link multiple kill chains like that together into an overall kill web, and whoever can do that F2, T2, EA more efficiently and more effectively has got the decisive advantage when we go into this. So I think those are some of the key things that I see are going to be common lessons that are going to apply, that are definitely going to apply, as we've seen in Ukraine and Iran and the Middle East situation, we're going to apply out in the Pacific as well.
One of the things that I think I heard you say was whoever senses first wins. Can you talk more about that? That's pretty profound.
Yeah, in today's world, there is such a multitude of fires capabilities, and long-range fires capabilities are prevalent in all arenas of the world now, and only increasingly so much. But I think what you've seen is this evolution arms race between sides over the years is that you have to stay mobile to survive, and you have to be highly dynamic. You have to be very agile and moving. you cannot set in place anymore. We taught the world, over the last 30 years and the different conflicts we've had, that if you dig in and sit, we're gonna kill you. That's how it works in a conflict, because the weapon capabilities, the ability to deliver has gotten so precise and so good that it's really hard to bunker down and be able to withstand. And so the response to that has been this almost hyper agility to be able to shoot and scoot and move and do stuff. And so when you do that, that complexity that comes out of that is what leads to the ISR hunt. And that's what gets into this. Whoever can really sense first and be able to put the package together to be able to find something, to be able to fix it, attribute it, to be able to track it as it's continuing moving and set up a viable targeting solution. And whoever can do that, make that happen, that's the one who's going to have the advantage.
Part of your last statement before we talked about sensing first, you were saying that there could be, or there probably would be, differences in a Pacific theater event. What would possibly be different, or what are you thinking or forecasting their differences would be in a Pacific theater conflict?
Yeah, I think one thing that stands out very much so is that it's a maritime kill web. If you see what Ukraine's accomplished in particular and what we have done against Iran, it is definitely illustrative of the power of a kill web, where I've got multiple kill chains all meshed together, working and synchronizing for mutual effect. That's important. What's different in the Pacific and really comes into play is you're talking about a maritime kill web. So there's a little bit of different nuances there, right? There's less choke points in a purely blue sea operation that you can concentrate forces and funnel. And there's scale. The scale of this thing in the Pacific is much, much greater. So that puts a complete or a complex factor in there that maybe is not what we see as apparent when you look at the Iranian operations that are taking place, the operations in Ukraine, because you're looking at a much greater scale with less areas to concentrate and focus. So that puts a premium on being able to understand, how do I cover that large scale? How do I enable a kill web in the maritime environment over those vast distances that I actually have to look across everything at once? I can't just concentrate, limited sensors in. I think another one that comes into play that kind of feeds into that, if you're going to be able to do that, you're going to have to be able to do it at scale, which means you're going to have to enable some autonomous maritime ISR. You're going to have these systems that can go out there, not for hours at a time and hunt. You're going to have to go out there for months at a time and hunt. And they're going to have to be self-sufficient, self-reliant. They're going to have to be able to be smart enough to be able to go out there. And you're talking about swarms, if you will, in the thousands of systems that are on the ocean surface, maritime vehicles that are out there autonomously operated with no humans on board. You're talking about subsurface equivalents of that, doing that undersea, and then coupled obviously with long-range UAV or drone capabilities. It's going to take that, multi-domain approach to be able to really get after this and get after that real maritime kill web capabilities. That's one of the second attributes, I think. And then the third one is what is a great lesson, I think, from Ukraine in particular, is you're going to have to be able to do dynamic targeting at almost a tactical level, but do it at a theater scale, where you're going to have to be responsive enough that, like in a tactical situation, that you're talking about seconds and maybe single-digit minutes from the find, fix, track, target, engage, and assess. You're not going to have the luxury of taking an entire expansive campaign across that theater and go up to a centralized headquarters, formulate a joint targeting list, get it approved, and then struck 4 days later. I think you're in a situation now where you're going to have to put out the ability to operate at an entire Pacific theater level, but do it with tactical engagements that are synchronized and working towards the same common effect, but totally decentralized control. They know what to do for centralized intent. They know what we're all trying to achieve, but they have the authority and the means to make the decisions at the local level and engage quickly. That's an important one. And I think when you take that into compilation with autonomous ISR, getting after this large kill web that's going to be maritime focused, that puts a premium on what we see with our Pacific allies. They're not exactly traditionally oriented to be able to fight that fight. And I know they realize it, they're taking large strides, but it's really going to put a premium on changing the way they approach, pull those lessons learned we talked about, that they're seeing the current evolution of conflict. They're leverage those lessons so they don't have to relearn them themselves coming out of Ukraine and in the Middle East, but then tailor them to their unique environment and then make sure that they're able to operate using mission command, using centralized intent, decentralized control, even further delegated execution. Leverage those capabilities so that they can apply it to their situation and be effective. And God forbid if war did break out. So.
All right. So fun question for you. I know that you're an instructor and a trainer and an expert in the field. If you had one key takeaway that your audience would get to understand from you today about what's happening in ISR with the ISR debrief, what would your main takeaway be?
One of the most critical, if not the most critical aspect of conflict today and looking ahead in the future is going to be the ISR. It's going to be the ability to generate ISR across all domains, across all different intelligence disciplines, synchronize it, which is different than just coordinating it, and fuse it together at speed and scale and do it more effectively and efficiently than your adversary. I think that's the decisive advantage looking ahead for warfare.
Chad, I really appreciate your time and your expertise today. If there's one thing I take away from this conversation, it's that the future isn't going to be decided by the biggest platform or the newest weapon system. It's really going to be decided by who can sense, understand, and act faster than their adversary. Whether we're talking about Ukraine or the Middle East or a potential conflict in the Pacific, ISR really remains at the center of every equation. And that's exactly why we, myself and Chad, decided to start the ISR Debrief to explore the developments, the technologies, and the lessons shaping today's operational environment and help defense professionals like you who are watching understand what matters and why. Chad, thanks again for joining me.
Look forward to doing this again with you next time. We'll see if we can get some other guest speakers involved and we'll continue to learn together.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad.
What if your training actually prepared you for the mission? At ISR University, we deliver immersive training across space, intelligence, electronic warfare, and targeting, built for real-world operations. Choose from our growing online course catalog, or let us build a tailored in-person training solution for your team. Train smarter at isruniversity.com.